Hi, Dinosaur Bob here. In the last couple of videos, we built out the Bugbear's Head Inn, a home base for groups of adventurers just getting started in the world of Cartyrion. Today we're going to go back to some more general topics and talk about how the people of Cartyrion mark the passing of time. As a part of this, we'll also be spending a little time talking about some of the heavenly bodies that appear in the skies above Cartyrion. By the time we're done, we'll have a calendar structure, and we'll also have a few more hooks for creating more lore for the world. And more lore for the world means hooks for more adventures for the world. So let's get started. We'll begin with marking the passage of time during the day, and we're going to introduce a fairly simple system, one that makes sense for the majority of the population. Let's start with the concept of day itself. For reference purposes, we'll presume that a day on Cartyrion is equivalent to a day here on Earth, 24 hours in length. But for most people, it's not necessary to think of the day as 24 hours. A smaller number of chunks that have some concrete meaning would make more sense. So we're going to break up the day into 8 watches. For those of us on Earth, a watch is 3 hours long. These equate well to the shifts of work or rest for laborers, and duty times for city guards and town criers, that sort of thing. So how do we define meaningful watches? Well, let's also presume that, like on Earth, sunrise and sunset happen at different times during the year, and the amount of time the sun is up or down varies as well. This means that sunrise and sunset are not good choices for deciding when a day begins. The two daily celestial events that occur at fixed times throughout the year are what we call noon and midnight, the time when the sun is highest overhead, and the time exactly halfway between two noons. And since we have the sun overhead almost every day, noon is the point that's the easiest to pinpoint, at least most days, assuming it's not cloudy. We're going to anchor our watch cycle on these points by placing the watch called midday squarely around the point of noon when the sun is highest in the sky, and the watch called midnight opposite that. That leaves 3 watches between these on either side. Starting from midnight, the next watch is still a time of darkness before sunrise. We'll call that the vigil watch. Next comes the watch during which the sun will rise for most folk, except perhaps those near the poles. Nevertheless, most folk will call this period the dawn watch, though some may use the term waking watch. Next comes the mid-morning watch, and that brings us to midday. Beyond midday, we have the late day watch, as the sun descends in the sky, but for most hasn't reached sunset yet. Sometime during the dusk watch over most of populated Cartyrion, the sun will set. And finally, after a day of work, an evening meal, and some time for relaxation at home or the local tavern, most folk will be heading off to bed sometime during the retiring watch. Midnight follows that, and we start the cycle again. We need to make one adjustment, though. Even though sunrise itself may vary throughout the year, it has become common practice for all to assume that the day begins with the dawn or waking watch. This is practical for most working folk who consider the day to begin when they get out of bed. So let's shuffle the table around a bit now to put the dawn watch at the top of the table. To help those of us from Earth to get a clearer picture of when these watches begin and end, let's throw in some Earth clock times. Let's also keep in mind that except for some sages or OCD-type despots that are anal about such things, the edges of these can be a bit fluid. Now let's put a bit of practical information into this table by considering 2 things that matter to most folk: meal times and the workday. For most folk, the workday spans the mid-morning, midday, late day, and dusk watches. By the time retiring watch comes around, the sun is down, farmers have left the fields, and most of the shops have closed for the night. The taverns, of course, are still open and are probably doing their best business. Now, most folk eat 3 meals a day. Breakfast toward the end of the dawn watch, lunch during the midday watch, and dinner during the early part of the retiring watch. And then there's the halflings. The halflings of Cartyrion, like halflings everywhere, love to eat. They have a few additional meal times built into their typical days. In fact, there's a meal time for every watch of the day. For the typical halfling, just like everyone else, the day begins with breakfast during the dawn watch. But the typical halfling will look to enjoy a brunch during the mid-morning watch. Then they'll join the rest of the larger folk for lunch during midday, of course. The late day watch brings tea time, and the dusk watch is time for a light supper to tide them over until dinner. Just like it is for everyone else, the retiring watch is the time for dinner, the big meal of the day. If our halflings are still up and about as the midnight watch comes around, they will want to partake of what they call a nightcap before going off to bed. And should they still be awake in the wee hours before dawn, a little snack will get them by until breakfast. A couple more thoughts about watches. Even though we're planning on designing the Cartyrion materials to be compatible with those two major RPG rule sets, we'll be defining some custom rule options of our own. One of these regards watches and the concepts of short and long rest. I'm seriously considering defining the short rest as being 1 watch in length. That's an hour shorter than those other rule sets make it. One reason for this is because the people of Cartyrion are comfortable in gauging how long a watch is. Counting hours isn't something the typical Cartyrion resident does. The other is it just makes sense to me. A short rest spanning the time of a watch gives time to relax, eat something, reorganize equipment and thoughts, and then set off again. Likewise, I'm considering defining the long rest as either 2 or 3 watches, and I'm leaning toward 2. Again, this is a shorter time than the other rule sets define, but I think it fits the world of Cartyrion better. Perhaps a rule that a long rest can either be 2 consecutive watches or 2 watches sleeping with only 1 watch of non-strenuous activity like standing guard and having nothing happen during your time in between. I'd like your thoughts on this. Please either vote in the poll that should be hovering in the corner right now, or leave a comment with your thoughts, or both. Okay, now that we've covered the watches of the day, let's start grouping days together. We'll start with the Cartyrion week. A week is 6 days long, not the 7 we're used to. The names of the days are pretty mundane. First day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, and sixth day, finally. This 6-day week is a product of the dwarves. They believed that after every 5 days of toiling in the mines or at the forges, there should be a day of relaxation and celebration. Dwarves everywhere still consider every 6th day as a day of rest, and prefer not to spend it at any sort of hard labor. The other races of Cartyrion picked up on this dwarven custom as well, and now the 6-day week, often with the 6th day being a rest day, is pretty universal. Now let's move on a bit. The Cartyrion year, like the Earth year, is 365 days long. To keep track of the passing of days, they are grouped into 12 sets of 30 days, or 5 weeks, each. The days in each of these groups are numbered from 1 to 30 so that we can start to form a date. These groups are equivalent to the months of our calendar, but Cartyrians don't use the term month. That term derives from moon, and as we'll soon see, the Cartyrion moons don't have a strong relationship to their yearly calendar. That's right, I said moons, plural. We'll get back to that shortly. The 12 groups of days or weeks are named after constellations that appear rising in the early night sky of each period. These 12 constellations, the Cartyrion zodiac if you like, memorialize 12 heroic figures in the history of Cartyrion. 12 more opportunities for us to expand on the lore of the world at some time in the future. For now, let's just list them. We've got the time of the Elvenhome tree, memorializing the great tree at the center of the Elvenhome forest, the tree under which the first elves awakened. The time of Kilthal's hammer, honoring the legendary forge hammer wielded by Kilthal Ironbeard of the dwarves. The time of Enfindiel's diadem honors the mithril and elven star circlet worn by Enfindiel Rolarin of the elves. The time of Elidia's river calls to mind the Nereid Elidia and the stream in which legend says she lived. The time of Amalthea's oak recalls the great oak tree home of the dryad Amalthea. The time of Grildrim remembers the Dragonar, father of dragons. The time of Knimvort's engine calls to mind a fantastical machine built by the legendary gnome Knimvort Limoblet. The machine was purported to be capable of converting charcoal into the finest diamonds. The time of Thirar's Carrack honors the first and greatest of the seafarer dwarves, Thirar Thunderheart, and the ship he sailed to explore the seas. The time of Vonbar's axe honors yet another dwarf, this time the legendary warrior Vonbar Greyhelm. The time of Anselin's village remembers the human responsible for leading the first group of men to build a cluster of permanent homes and take up farming, instead of relying on nomadic hunting. The time of Galarin's crown is named after the golden crown worn by Galarin Argenthair, the first ruler of the First Kingdom. And finally, the time of Philibert's flagon, referencing the legendary magical flagon of ale used by the halfling Philibert Hopesinger when he ended a war by convincing men and dwarves to sit down and party together. Now, those of you with a little bit of math smarts will notice that so far we've only accounted for 360 of our 365 days. The other 5 days are special and mark important celestial events of the calendar year. They're holidays that fall outside of any month. They're universally celebrated, at least by the major races. The first of these, the day the year begins, is called, not surprisingly, New Year's Day. It falls on the day of the spring equinox, the equivalent of March 22nd, give or take a day on Earth. First solstice comes 3 months later, then Mid-Year's Day, then second solstice, and finally the last day of the year, the last day holiday, called by some New Year's Eve. The groups of months separated by the special holidays mark out the seasons of Cartyrion. Here things start to vary based on where on the planet you are. In the equatorial regions, where the growing season is all year long, there really isn't much difference from one season to the next. And so the people here simply call them first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, and fourth quarter. As you move to the northern mid-latitudes, though, the seasons are tied to the growing cycles on the farms. Here, they're called the season of planting, the season of growing, the season of harvest, and the season of sleeping. Going farther north to the polar regions, there are really only 2 seasons: the half of the year when the sun is in the sky almost all day and night, and the half year when it doesn't rise at all. These are called the seasons of light and twilight, respectively. Heading south from the equatorial regions, the seasons are the same, but they're shifted by a half year, like this. So, what does the calendar actually look like? Well, here's a representation of a 1-year calendar that a resident of Cartyrion might have hanging on the wall of his home somewhere. You'll notice the year name at the top of the calendar. We'll get to what Common Reckoning means in a few minutes. But first, there's a little more information that the calendar should provide, and that's information about the moons of Cartyrion. As I mentioned, there are 2. The larger of the 2 is a bit larger in the sky than the Earth's moon appears to be. It is a ruddy red color and doesn't throw a lot of moonlight. It goes through its phases slower than the Earth's moon as well. In fact, it takes 83 days to go through one full cycle of phases. And because of this, the people of Cartyrion have named this celestial body the Ponderous Eye. And when it is full, they will say that the Ponderous Eye is fully open, an event that happens no more than 4 times a year. And after picking a random date for the first one of the year that we're looking at, we've now marked the calendar with the dates when the ponderous eye is fully open. The second moon of Cartyrion is smaller, a bit smaller than Earth's moon, but also much brighter. In fact, the light it throws at night is pretty much the same as that of our moon here on Earth. This moon takes only 23 days to go through a cycle of phases, much faster than its companion, and so it has been named the darting eye. And here's what our calendar looks like when we mark the days when the darting eye is fully open. You'll notice that there's one day, the 14th day in the time of Galeron's crown, that seems to have a special mark. This is indeed a special day, a day that occurs only once every 1,902 days, about 5.2 years. This is the night of the necromancer's eye, when both moons are full and in conjunction. The darting eye appears directly in front of the ponderous eye, giving the appearance of a white-pupiled, bloodshot eye hanging in the sky. All the folk of Cartyrion regard this as a night when dark powers are at their strongest. So now we know what 1 year looks like. So let's talk now about how the people of Cartyrion keep track of the passage of the years. There are several different reckonings that count the years of history. The sages and clerics of the elves and the dwarves, the goblins and the humans, each keep their own count of years since their awakenings. The gnomes use the dwarven count, and the halflings use the human count when they bother at all. To make sense of the rest of this discussion, we're going to have to pick a point that we'll be calling today for the rest of our talk about the time on Cartyrion. Today is a day 21,478 years after the creator of worlds brought Cartyrion into being. 625 years after that, the first of the Astralar arrived and brought forth the Fae and the Elves. The Elves mark this as the start of their reckoning of the years, with a count that we will refer to in the future as Elven Reckoning. You'll see the initials ER after a year to denote this time period. 988 years later, the dwarves and the gnomes awakened, and they too began to record their history. So we've also got Dwarven Reckoning, which will be abbreviated DR. You can see how this is going to go. 1,048 years more passed before the goblins were awakened, and after they did, they began recording history according to Goblin Reckoning, or GR. Another 2,018 years went by, and humans and halflings awakened. Their history is recorded using Man Reckoning, or MR. And so the various races went on for many years, over 14,000 years in fact, each counting their own histories according to their own reckonings. It was probably confusing to anyone that had dealings across cultures. But then catastrophe struck. We're not going to describe this catastrophe just yet. Perhaps it was a war among the Astralar that spilled onto Cartyrion. Perhaps it was a giant meteor hitting the world, or a group of very powerful mages or clerics that got a bit carried away. We will describe this event at some point in the future, and it will give us a lot of opportunity for adventure hooks, ruins from before the event, relics of the event itself, perhaps even artifacts that brought it about. But for now, the only lore we're going to add is the fact that all the races of the world decided that these events were so epic that they warranted marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. From this point onward, while the sages and clerics of each race still track the years according to their own reckonings, the common folk of all the races have settled on one new reckoning that starts from the point that the great strife ended, the common reckoning. And that brings us to today, 2,170 years after the great strife, the year that everyone knows as 2171 of the Common Reckoning, or 2171 CR for short. And that's it for our discussion of marking time on Cartyrion. We got a lot done today. We defined the concept of watches to pass the day. We've defined a 6-day week and 5-day months. We've assembled a calendar by naming 12 months and the 5 special holidays of each year. We've discussed the 2 moons of Cartyrion, We've named them, given them some properties, and even a bit of lore on those special days when they appear overlapping in the night sky. We've put 12 constellations into the night sky as well, and used them to help mark the passage of the year. We've defined the systems by which the learned members of the races record their histories, and the common system that everyone else uses. In the next few videos, though, we're going to be doing something a little different. So far, we focused on world building, but now we're going to have to shift our focus a bit to game building. So far, everything we've done has been generic, designed to be droppable into almost any role-playing game rule system. But my next steps are going to involve starting to set up encounters, and for that, we need to understand the impact of what the various rule sets will have. And so we're going to take a look at the two major rule systems that I've said all along would be the inspirational source for Cartyrion. All right, and these are based on the open gaming license content made available by those two important RPG publishers, both situated just outside of Seattle. They come from the same root, but they've diverged, and as they did, they've developed their own rabid followings. I'm not sure they're so different that they can't be bridged in a way that will allow Cartyrion to be playable in either of those systems, as well as in the hybrid that I hope to actually develop here. We're going to start in the next video by looking at character generation and development to see what we can put together that won't be too offensive to the purists on both sides. It ought to be interesting. And so, until then, may the dice be with you.